Mr. Mick Wall is delighted to have him with us. He's written a book called Life in the First Lane. Well, some of the Scandal hooligans are writing in saying, Life in the Fast Lane. The riff that trips me up every time I try and play it. Groovy way to head into the weekend. Mick's latest book is called Life in the Fast Lane, the Eagles' reckless ride down the rock and roll highway. Delighted to be joining us from his penthouse apartment somewhere in the hills, overlooking LA. Mick himself. Mick, how are you, mate?
I'm really good, Giles. It's fantastic to talk to you again.
Always good to speak to you as well. How have you been? You've been busy? You've been doing a few bits and pieces? Another book hits the shelves.
Well, to be honest, yes, another book hits the shelves. I have been really busy. I think the last time we spoke was when my Ghosted Dio biography.
That was right. Out. Yeah.
And since then, I worked with Stephen Wilson from Porcupine Tree on, it's kind of a memoir, but it's not your normal sort of thing. It's not chronological. It's not, it's more thematic.
Oh, thematic. Okay. Is it immersive and is it interactive? Is that what we're saying?
It is terribly immersive and it breaks the fourth wall and all that good stuff, But that came out about a year ago, and in the meantime, I was working on this Eagles book, which is a more long-term project, and it's a Mick Wall book. So this is kind of the follow-up to my Hendrix book, which I'm astounded to learn came out nearly 4 years ago. It doesn't feel like it, but it's in a similar vein in the sense that, what can you tell us that we don't already know about the Eagles from other books or DVDs? And so what I do is I plow in straight into Los Angeles in the late 60s, early 70s, and I take you on a wild ride. So not only do you get to know all the nitty-gritty about the guys in the Eagles and about the people around them, David Geffen, Irvin Azoff, all these people that were making their bones back in the music business back in the early 70s, but also Crosby, Stills and Nash, Linda Ronstadt. It's a really broad spectrum. Nixon is in there, Reagan is in there because Bernie Marsden, he dated Reagan's daughter. So that's in there, and which meant they had narcs going on tour with them, which was a little bit of a juxtaposition back in the mid.
Before we take a running leap across the canyon, let's start with some basics. So the Eagle, because as the saying goes, radio friendly unit shifters. People think of the Eagles as the best of the Eagles and all those CDs. I'm dating myself now, but they seem to be completely AOR. They seem to be completely FM friendly, and if you like, a little bit bland. Some might say, but hey. They spring from somewhere which is what that late 60s counterculture or that mid 60s. How does it all happen, Mick?
Well, they came out of the late 60s when they were fans. They weren't part of that first wave. They weren't Neil Young or David Crosby or Joni Mitchell, but they came right after. So there's nothing really very 60s about the Eagles, apart from, the droopy moustaches and the way they dressed and the fact that they were in Laurel Canyon. They took all the things that Graham Parsons and the Kershaw Flyers and the Byrds, when they went country, they took all that country rock as it became known, and they made it stunningly commercial. I mean, their greatest hits is now the biggest selling compilation album of all time. They became so big in America in the 70s. They were bigger than the Beatles. At the same time, they were crazier or as crazy as Led Zeppelin. In the book, it talks about their tours where they're all traveling on Learjets. But they'd get to certain towns or cities in America, 5 months into the Enormo tour. And they were so jaded, they'd decide the local female population wasn't enough. So they would send the jet back to LA to pick up all the hot groupie chicks. But we're talking the 70s.
Yes, of course. We're talking historical documents here, Nick.
Historical accuracy. That's
I can see the parchment you're reading from, the listeners can't.
And they'd fly them in and then literally fly them home again. They had a saying for it: love them and leer them. And this is a time when, Don Henley, in the book, it talks about how Don Henley has this big affair with Stevie Nicks from Fleetwood Mac. In fact, she becomes pregnant and ends up aborting the baby. And that was the genesis of her song, Sarah. And this is a time when Fleetwood Mac were the other huge California sound band, and Stevie was having white grand pianos craned into her hotel suites where she'd be for 2 nights or something. Nothing was too over the top. The music business was absolutely swirling in money. The Eagles were the biggest earners for their record company. And at the same time, while they're singing about peaceful, easy feelings and taking it easy, they are not doing any of those things. Don Henley and Glenn Frey, the 2 main guys who wrote most of the big hits, they were pretty monstrous. John Lennon once said of the Beatles, you don't get as big as the Beatles unless you are complete
so-and-sos. Yeah, so-and-sos, yes.
Yeah, but so-and-sos.
So-and-sos, yeah.
The Beatles were the biggest so-and-sos of all. Well, in the 70s, the Eagles were the biggest so-and-sos of all. To the point where, eventually Bernie Leadon is out the door because he keeps wanting to get the banjo out.
And Bernie, who is Bernie Leadon? Sorry, is
there were 4 of them. Don on the drums and vocals, Glenn Frey on guitar and vocals, Randy Meisner on bass, but also vocals. He sung "Take It to the Limit" and some other big hits. And Bernie Leadon was another guitarist and singer, and they started out very egalitarian. And the idea was rootsy, country rock, authentic. And Bernie was the guy that could play anything with strings, slide guitar, banjo. He was the roots guy, the authentic country rock guy. He played with Gene Clark and Graham Parsons and all these people. But by the time you get to one of these nights, Bernie's not feeling it. They're turning into a rock band. How awful. But they were a rock band. And Glenn and Don had always wanted to have a rock band. They didn't come from California. They didn't have particular interest in country music. Don was crazy about rock and Glenn was crazy about Motown, but mainly they were crazy about hits. They were the group that came up with the saying, art for art's sake, hit singles for so-and-so's sake. And they kind of lived. They lived that. They completely lived it. They had Glenn and Don shared this enormous mansion, which they called the house with the $1 million view. And this was how they rolled. There was no kind of, should we tone it down a bit? Doesn't that look a bit flash? Not flash enough. More flash, please. More money, more hits, more drugs, more sex, more everything, baby. We're in Hollywood in the 70s and there are no rules anymore.
Because this is the thing, Mick, I always say to people when I talk about Led Zeppelin, going on tour, and nobody had played stadium like Zeppelin. Nobody had the huge success that they were pushing the boundaries. And the management and the music business, they were still looking for little guy. Okay, they might wear a few bees around their necks, but they had no idea what they were doing. So they're making it up as they go along. And as, quote unquote, the 60s dream dies, man, it goes into overdrive. You've got people shifting significant amounts of money, like you're saying, swirling. So everybody goes, hey, it's the 70s. AIDS hasn't been invented yet.
Absolutely.
So, who are you to tell us what we can or cannot do?
I came into the business in the 70s and I can tell you the absolute received wisdom was that, venereal disease wasn't an issue anymore. We have the antibiotics, the injections, whatever it is. Drugs weren't, they didn't even call them drugs. It was about consciousness expanding. It was about finessing your art. It was about exploring the imagination and being transgressive, going outside the norm. And the rule of thumb was the only drug you have to be careful about is heroin, which of course we now know is nonsense. You have to be careful of all drugs, all things, all the time. But back then, I used to say, when I did my Zeppelin book, I used to say quite often, they were like the first men in space. I mean, it hadn't been done before. I mean, even the Beatles didn't get that far. They dominated the world, the culture, but they stopped touring in the mid-'60s. Their final shows at Shea Stadium, their backstage rider was 4 deck chairs, 200 cigarettes, and some Coca-Cola.
And that is what you call rock and roll excess, Mick. That really is.
Well, by the time you get to the Eagles, I mean, the rider is 50 pages long, and the saying is, no blow, no show. We're in that era. And because no one could have foreseen how different the 80s would be and the price everybody would have to pay for that kind of hedonistic lifestyle, they really felt there were no rules. They could do whatever they like. And you have to say, each album became more and more awesome until you get to Hotel California. And Hotel California, the song and the album, Life in the Fast Lane, is from that album. Hotel California, I mean, like Stairway to Heaven, only better known, better known because it was a huge hit. There's a part of the book where in the wake of the success of Hotel California, Glenn Frey is showing someone around his new spread, and it's in the mountain, one of his new spreads, and it's out in the mountains, and he's saying, look, can you see that miles away, that tallest peak of that mountain? And the guy says, yes. He goes, I own that, and Hotel California bought it for me. So no band had done that kind of thing. No band had got to that place. I mean, even the Stones, for all their fame, never sold the quantities of records that the Eagles did. And it's bizarre too, because unlike Zeppelin or the Stones, where they, Mick and Keith, Jimmy Page and Robert Plant, no one really knew what the Eagles looked like even, unless they bought the magazines. No MTV, no social media. It was just the music. And I think you have to say, look, of course, a lot of it seems very vanilla. But at the same time, they had hit after hit after hit after hit. They never put out a bad one. And when they broke up, they had no intention of coming back. Though, of course, they did, as they all do eventually.
But the thing is, again, they were at the right time because everybody was buying hi-fi stuff. This is the reason that, Dark Side of the Moon goes spectacularly huge because you can play with your speakers in your hi-fi. AOR, adult-orientated rock, FM comes out in the States. So you need something that can appeal to everybody that isn't peace and love and hippie stuff, but it certainly isn't Skinhead, proper Southern rock. I've got a very love Skinhead. I've got a very big piece for Skinhead, obviously. But that's a different type. And so this country in your truck, the people on the West Coast can get, the people in the Midwest can get. It's absolutely right of its time.
It is. I mean, that Pink Floyd analogy, that is absolutely spot on. I mean, obviously not musically in the genre sense, but, who really knew what Pink Floyd looked like back in the 70s? You'd see a picture, but it didn't resonate. It wasn't like David Bowie or Rod Stewart. You never remembered what the hell these very average looking people in jeans and dandruff, who cares? But the record, you're absolutely right. I mean, these were high-end productions, and it came in the album era where when they went in to make an album, they made it like writing a book. You know, there would be side one. So you'd have your opening track. You'd have the track that closed side one, intermission, flip it over, big number on side two, and end with some epic moment. Floyd went one better by, I mean, Dark Side of the Moon clearly was one piece divided up on the record into tracks. The Eagles never got to that stage. They didn't really need to. But again, it wasn't about, you know, you could project whatever you liked onto their music. You didn't need to know what they looked like, and you didn't really know what they looked like. I mean, I remember finding out the drummer was the singer and thinking, I don't like that. It doesn't, that's not working for me. So I just forgot about it and just got into the music. Suddenly I'm the singer. You know, suddenly this stuff is about me. It's about the world. And it was done so beautifully. So, you know, people forget the amount of craft and the amount of sophistication and artistry that goes into these things. And for me, it was because they weren't obsessed with country music. They wanted to be rock and roll stars. And so they took that. It's like Bob Marley, you know, Bob Marley, reggae music. Absolutely, absolutely. Really, though, his audience was a rock audience. They were an album buying, mainly white rock audience. That's how he came to dominate the marketplace in the 70s and 80s. And the Eagles, very similar. You know, 9/10 of their audience never bought a Graham Parsons record or knew much about David Crosby or the Byrds. They just loved, you know, the songs of the Eagles. One of These Nights, Hotel California, Best of My Love, Life in the Fast Lane, Take It to the Limit. I mean, there's a reason why their compilation album is the biggest seller of all time.
And it speaks to everybody. I have, in the 80s, I used to sit and drink in a little sailor's bar called, not what you think, called Webster's in the back of Venice. And all the yachty guys had come in. And it was a sort of bar that you take shades with because you weren't sort of quite, you know, what time you were going to get out. And two things would have these hard-bitten yachtsmen crying, Jackson Browne, How Long Have I Been Sleeping? And Take It to the Limit, You Know I've Always Been a Dreamer. Hard men weeping buckets over their San Miguels.
Well, yes. I mean, and that is the power of music. You know, these days there's a lot of debate about are you allowed to enjoy a certain music if the artist, in your eyes, is offensive or unacceptable on some level. None of that mattered back then. I mean, that's a whole rabbit hole I don't really want to go down, but
let's not talk about the tubes, shall we? Okay.
It was taken at face value. You know, no one had any idea that 40, 50 years later, people like me would be writing books about it and eulogizing that era and dissecting that era and going, wow, man, look at this. This is like the last days of Rome, you know, the decadence and the unbridled sensory overload. At the same time, there's these guys making this incredible music. You know, if it had been that easy, all the other bands would have done it as well, but they didn't because they couldn't.
And after the high watermark, as Hunter S. Thompson would call it, Hotel California, it's massive, it's bloated, it's magnificent. There's only one way to go. And let's get our hats on here. You know, the Eagles as a symbol of America post-Vietnam and the crash, because suddenly it is that crash. You know, we've got Reagan on it. You know, got Reagan coming in 1980. That whole hippie dream has gone. And obviously the band themselves just explode.
No, absolutely. The final album, The Long Run, I mean, it's odd because when I was researching the book, I realized at a certain point, I can't even remember any of the songs on The Long Run. Surely I must know some of them. And of course you do. When you put it on, you go, oh, that was them. Oh. But it didn't have the same impact. They themselves were so far over the rainbow at that point that, you know, they couldn't even stand to be in the same room. I think for them, it came to a sort of a natural end. They were richer than God, you know, and everything they touched turned to platinum. And, you know, that is always, you know, when you get, it's like a rose, you know, they say just before it starts to wilt and die, the perfume is at its strongest. And I think that was the Eagles with Hotel California. After that, I mean, you know, at the end of the day, they're musicians. They're not geniuses. They're not innovative in that sense. What do? Well, they take their sacks of millions of dollars and they say, you know what? We're good. We've had 10 years of this. Let's go and do something else that isn't so hard, isn't so pressured. And of course, that coincided in America with the advent of what we now know as classic rock radio. So suddenly, and this is the days of catalog where, you know, records are what make you rich, not touring, unlike now. And so they didn't have to tour. They didn't have to do anything. The money still kept coming in and still does, but particularly the 80s just kept coming. And then, of course,
CDs come out. CDs come out, so you have to get the whole lot down on CD. Get rid of your vinyl. You know, throw your vinyl away. Get the CDs, and then, of course, the vinyl comes back in again. And so you have to. Yeah, exactly. That's.
And what you were saying about stereo, exactly so. Except now CD comes in, because remember the hype about CD was it's so much. You hear it so much better, you know. So of course the Eagles, Floyd, all these people. That's where you go to get your CD superior listening experience. But what I was going to say, Giles, is at that point they were sort of like where you are now. You know, they were out in the sunshine. They were so good at what they did. They just cruised, man.
Yeah, exactly. You know, the willing groupie on the side, the pool just at perfect temperature. Mick, I don't know where you've put the webcam, but you described my life perfectly. Again, because, and this is the thing though, because, you know, now it's a business. They were perhaps one of the first big commercial acts, but they would never have been able to get away with that behavior, that rock and roll behavior. I mean, I've interviewed a couple of ex-girlfriends of various members of the Eagles, and they have some interesting stories and an awful lot of rehab to tell about, because it was behind that whole American Pie image, or, you know, the desperado, the man on the frontier saving the states or saving the reservation or whatever. There is this absolute mayhem going on back behind them.
Absolutely. I mean, when the final tour was over in 81, you know, Don Henley throws a end of tour party at his home. And it's so cliche now, but at the time, these were how the cliches were made. He has this big party. He gets Hollywood's most famous madame to provide all the female company, all the roadies and all the people that are their whole hangout entourage scene. They're there. There's mountains of drugs, everything you can think of. And the party goes on for days. But at the end of it, one of the girls ODs, another one calls the cops, and Henley ends up being arrested and charged with a lot of nasty stuff, which the book talks about, which he only, you know, escaped jail really, or opprobrium, through all the money his lawyers and his managers threw at it to make it go away, including paying off the girls in question. These days, with camera phones, with the you know, this whole universe of media that's trained upon all of us, you could not. There's no way you could walk away from that. But back then, you could cover stuff up, you know, because if you weren't there, how do you prove it? And if you've got 10 guys saying that isn't what happened, and there's some poor girl of ill repute saying it is what happened, and the guy's a millionaire, guess who wins, you know? So he got arrested. He did get charged. It went on his record, but he never saw 1 second inside a jailhouse or anything like that. He was still a lotus eater by the pool.
And yet, there's all that rock star behavior, but you've got to have the talent and the songs. Otherwise, you go down the Motley Crue path. you're living the rock star lifestyle. When I was ill, I read the Heroin Diaries by Nikki Sixx, and not the thing to read when you got COVID, but anyway. And you just think, okay, that's fine. But when you listen to the music, it doesn't kind of do it for me. And yet Eagles, as everybody loves the Eagles. That's a line from a film, from one of the comic strip films.
Yeah. I think at the time as well, we were a lot more innocent in our knowledge about how these things pan out. Hollywood Babylon was a book. Oh, could it be true? No one understood just how this was an everyday lifestyle choice. And the Eagles, because they did make this, let's not be scared to say it, beautiful music, quite often soul-touching music. It's like, well, no. These are the guys, Best of My Love, no, they take it easy, peaceful, easy listening, no. Yeah. They just will not accept that these guys could be as bad as they were painted. But in mitigation to them, all the bands were like that back then. It's just that only the Eagles and Fleetwood Mac and one or two others had that huge success and that enormous amount of money and influence to take it to the limit, to literally find, first of all, is there a limit? No. Keep going. Then, of course, you find there is a limit, but by then it's too late, baby. You're where you are. And you feel justified because you are the great Don Henley with this beautiful cafe creme vocal. You are Glenn Frey, who is this, Glenn Frey was obsessed with James Dean. This is something the book talks about. He felt he was a rock and roll rebel. So, of course he could do whatever he liked. He's a rock. Don't you get it? He's a rock. We
may look like a bunch of country guys, but we are, in fact, beneath this, we are rebels. We are rock and rollers, and that whole situation.
Absolutely. I mean, their second album, Desperado, which was their biggest flop, but that second album was the whole conceit of it. The concept was that the old cowboys, that how the West was won. The cowboys that rode into town and killed people and had all the girls. That in the modern world were rock and roll stars. And childish and absurd as it sounds and is, back in the early to mid 70s, there was a lot of truth to that. I mean, obviously they didn't come in shooting people, but there were a lot of people got hurt. There were a lot of, as it were, bodies left behind in the road, including band members. Joe Walsh, when he joined the band, after Bernie left in disgust, was asked to leave, Joe Walsh comes in on his first tour with the band, which is the Hotel California tour.
A quiet personality, Joe. Obviously a very quiet person, reserved, etc.
Well, he had his own chainsaw, which he brought on the road with him, specifically to destroy anything that got on his nerves, which was almost everything. And the others were like, "Oh, that's just Joe. Joe's a crazy guy," in the background. It's people screaming and running for their lives. And so there is a lot to laugh about, and I think we have to enjoy that era for what it was. It's not now.
Yeah.
And I think to try and apply modern ideas, modern.
You can get your pronouns mixed up and you're in big trouble here, Mick. I mean, let's face it. But yeah, I mean, it's totally before Me Too. It is knuckle dragging in its thing of women. The Time, not your book. Talking about time, I'm going to run out of time, Mick. I'm going to run out of. I'm going to crash.
Giles, it always goes so fast with it. You are the living personification of life in the fast lane.
And that will come back to haunt me, Wall. I'll tell you this much anyway. The book is called Life in the Fast Lane, The Eagles' Reckless Ride Down the Rock and Roll Highway. It's by the great Mick Wall. Mick, if people want to follow you, you do the socials, you've got books. Are you still doing the pods, by the way?
Yes, I am. You can find me on Spotify and iTunes and all that stuff. I don't have a website anymore. They kind of fell into, I don't know, they're not so No one cares. You need to see it on your phone. Twitter banned me because I was so rude, let's put it that way, about the British government. So now I'm back on Twitter, obviously, but it's now at Mick Blackwall.
There you go.
Okay? At Mick Blackwall.
The book is called Life in the Fast Lane. It's about the Eagles. Mick, it's been an absolute pleasure to speak to you today, mate.
Always, Giles, always.